Welcome back to After Order, a series from Macrodose and the Alameda Institute exploring power, sovereignty, and crisis in today's unstable world. In this week's episode, we're talking digital sovereignty in the age of big tech. What does it mean that the infrastructures underpinning our everyday lives, from search and cloud computing to communication and logistics, are owned and controlled by a tiny handful of Silicon Valley elites? What does that concentration of power mean for democracy, for states, and for the possibility of political autonomy in the digital age? And what, if anything, can we do about it? Joining me to explore these questions are Cecilia Rikap and Paolo Gerbaudo. Cecilia is Professor of Economics and Head of Research at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at University College London. Paolo is Senior Researcher at the Faculty of Political Science and Sociology at the Complutense University of Madrid and author of The Great Recoil, Politics After Populism and Pandemic. In 2025, Cecilia and Paolo were co-authors on a major report for the Alameda Institute entitled Reclaiming Digital Sovereignty, a roadmap to build a digital stack for people and the planet. The report sets out a bold vision for treating digital infrastructure as a public good, one that is democratically governed, ecologically sustainable, and oriented towards social need rather than private profit. What would it take to construct a public interest digital stack? Who has the capacity to do it? And how do you navigate a world shaped by both corporate monopolies and intensifying geopolitical competition? In a moment where sovereignty is increasingly exercised through platforms and protocols, this question becomes unavoidable. So what would it mean to reclaim digital infrastructure? All that and more in today's After Order. Paolo, Cecilia, welcome to After Order.
Hi, it's great to be here.
So I wanted to start with this report you both co-authored with a whole bunch of collaborators, I should say, from 2024 on reclaiming digital sovereignty. I suppose the first question is a scene setter. What was your core argument? What was the point you were trying to make and deliver with this?
So basically, there were two main points. The first one is that the whole world, even states, have become dependent on big tech companies at such a fundamental level that if you think about what these companies are selling, these are today's control technologies. These are the technologies that enable us to organize our everyday life, to organize how a government works, how companies work. So it's basically every single institution, organization, people on earth has become liable on the technologies that are controlled by these companies. You may say, okay, what's the deal there? Is if they are just good technologies, what's the problem then? But actually, it's not just about whether they do good or bad. It's also about the power that this has given a few, again, a handful of companies. So this is one of the points. And we could have just continued doing our research, actually, and explaining why this was bad. And we can discuss more about that. But at that moment in time, and since then, more and more, we realized that we had, if you want, a political responsibility as people that were doing research on these topics to also try to think in the most creative possible way to embrace the idea of political imagination and try to think, okay, if we want to put together a whole set of recommendations that are bold but still necessary to try to at least tame a bit the power of these companies and to build alternatives, what can we do? And this sort of resulted after discussions and so on and invites to a lot of people in the report.
And I think the general context is really that digital sovereignty is central to sovereignty writ large. And in recent years, sovereignty has been such an issue debated heavily alongside control as a correlate of sovereignty, really, especially by the populist right, but seen often sovereignty in a very anachronistic way. Sovereignty has been just kind of control over borders, control over territory, when in fact you cannot assert real control over territory if you have zero control over the technology, which in this day and age actually define what a territory is, map out the territory, allow you to manage the territory. And these technologies are for countries, I think our standpoint is especially as Europeans and Latin Americans. I mean, Latin America and Europe are two world regions where basically populations, institutions, and companies have very, very little control over these technologies through which you assert actual sovereignty, actual control over your territory. So I think that we intervene at a moment where, in a way, the debate was already developing, was already getting some degree of maturity. many people were finally kind of gathering and asserting this need, but also when there was a very clear lack of saying, but what does this mean in practice? Right? Is this just a slogan that anybody can use? Or how can we be serious about implementing digital sovereignty?
I mean, I suppose it does get taken up a bit as a slogan, digital sovereignty. I mean, one of the claims certainly made in this country, in the United Kingdom, is that we have to have data centers here because that's going to be a version of digital sovereignty, right? Regardless, in how it's usually presented, of who actually owns and controls and manages those data centers, for example. So I think you want to challenge some of that setup, that it's not just about whether you have a physical location of this stuff, it's also about what are you going to do with it and who determines that.
Absolutely. Actually, sovereignty can be understood in different ways, not only digital sovereignty. One is associated with territory, but as a Latin American, I know that although you can claim you have a sovereign territory, then the US can totally govern inside your territory. And a very explicit way of doing that is by installing military bases in your territory. And I think this is a good analogy with the data center story, because the data centers, unlike any other form of foreign direct investment where the effect can be contestable. For some, it will be no, you're sitting part of your resources to foreign companies, but for others will be no, they are a source of employment, and there will be all these trade-offs and discussions on whether you want or not the foreign direct investment. All this cannot be even considered when it comes to a data center because they don't generate employment. Once they are built, it's just a couple of dozen employees that will be doing technical jobs. They don't generate any sort of structural transformation or any effect in the local, any positive effect, let's say, in the local area where they're installed, while at the same time, all the claimed investments are just like completely exaggerated figures because you still need to import all the semiconductors to install your data center. And once you have it, it's just an extraction of electricity, of drinkable water. So definitely it expands nature extractivism, put at the service of what these companies do best, which is not only data extractivism, but also capturing knowledge. And this is what they do here in the UK. They capture knowledge from Oxford, from Cambridge University, from every single university in London, and so on and so forth, that have public money, so taxpayers' money, that then ends up feeding the pockets of the richest people on earth. So definitely, these days, we cannot think that sovereignty is simply about territory. And the same can be said about the nationality of the capital. And I think that this is important also to be said. The problem is not mainly that these are US companies or Chinese companies. The problem is that decisions about what technologies we have for such important technologies, and today we're also talking about generative AI. So the decision about what technologies we get and which ones we don't, for what technology is used, what type of data is retrieved and which data is not, who gets access to the data, and so on and so forth, is being made and behind closed doors by a few corporations. This is what should be democratized, and this is what democracy should be about having the power to decide what technologies are developed and where the money, the public money, but also more broadly a society's efforts go in terms of developing these technologies. So I think that indeed, sovereignty is one of these buzzwords these days, and almost every single public servant will be now and then being confronted with, okay, we need to do some sovereign policies, and what do they mean? And I think it's more important than ever to explain these differences, because otherwise you may end up just thinking, okay, let's give the money to Corwip because it's a UK company, and then this company is a satellite company completely subordinated and dependent on US big tech and replicating the same strategies and the same ways of controlling through technology.
So I wanted to pick up on that and get into some of the proposals, which is one of them is you talk about not just taxing the revenues that big tech is generating in various parts of the world. I mean, there are various countries in Europe that have tried to do this. The digital services taxes that France and Britain have, absolutely detested by the Trump regime and by US big tech. And really, you're talking tiny sums that are being applied here. But you talk about expanding that into capturing exactly something you mentioned, Cecilia, which is this capture of knowledge and of social value in knowledge, and trying to apply a tax to this use of knowledge by US and any other big tech adopting these sort of business models. I'm just wondering how that would actually work, and if there are any examples that you've got globally where something like this has been applied.
So first of all, how can we calculate this? With data, it's very easy. We have already statistics about the internet penetration in every country in the world. We also have stats about the number of hours that connected people spend on the internet. So there are already some proposals on the table that basically just say, okay, let's say that 1 hour connected to the internet generates this amount of data. Let's put a value to that amount of data, and then let's just calculate it broadly. And you can charge that to every single company, regardless that above a threshold of revenues and above a threshold of data gathering, regardless of whether the company is charging or not for their services. So you have Google with Google Search, and they are harvesting data every time we're searching. So they should pay. It's not that only those that are selling something like, let's say, Netflix subscriptions that also gather data should be paying. And if the company doesn't want to pay this average, they should communicate the amount of data that they are generating in order to make the calculation more accurate. And if they still don't want to pay, the other alternative is to share the data, granular data, and accept to be audited so that the algorithms can be audited in a way that prevents the companies from what now everybody will accept and know, which is that these algorithms are strategically designed to generate addiction. So if this cannot be audited or regulated, at least a way to still not compensate for the addiction, but to again try to even the playing field, is to start levying taxes on the capacity of these companies to control, to capture, and appropriate what should be commons. And this is done for nature. This is done in countries where, like copper in Chile or crop in Argentina, there is a history of levying taxes to companies that capture part of the richness of the soil, because the understanding is that the richness of the soil should belong to the people that live in that country. Well, this is just extending that logic to the generation of data and also to the use of knowledge by these companies. And there are ways to proxy that as well. Like, for instance, this is one example, but it's like when you go and look into the patents, you can see the scientific papers that were quoted in the patents. And you can just then say, okay, if my research was useful for your patent, then I need to have a cut either of the royalties that you get or of the revenues that you get by using this knowledge.
This does get you to the center of the issue of sovereignty, really, which is that, well, these very large companies that are so deeply embedded and monopolizing or near monopolizing great chunks of what we now have as social and economic life, is that they may decide just not to pay it and not provide the service. I mean, that strikes me as that is a fairly credible threat from Google to just say, do you know what, we're just not going to allow anybody in Britain to access Google search. Yeah, and they could plausibly do that. It's not too hard technically for them to do that. And Britain's just one country amongst many where they operate. So what's the actual points of leverage here? I mean, what do you do to really reassert sovereignty at that point?
I mean, the level of digital dependency, which in a way we can take as the converse, I mean, it's the opposite of digital sovereignty, is really staggering. I mean, there is a digital dependency index that has been tracking how digital dependencies has been growing and growing, especially in European countries, and overshooting kind of safety limit. And one example that came to my mind is, I mean, in the last years, I've collaborated and worked with different European universities. And it was around kind of 5 different universities, and I had to open 5 different Google accounts. So all the universities I worked at, they were all using Gmail, they were using Google Cloud, sometimes a combination of Google and Microsoft even. And it just tells you, I mean, the universities are supposed to be some of the most technologically sophisticated institutions in any country. I mean, they have the informatics department, right? They're supposed to have servers. They add capacity. They add their own email servers. And now not even universities are able to do that. And indeed, when I think about, I mean, sometimes colleagues discuss that. I mean, do you realize that your files, the things you use for your work, including basically your historical file, is not on your computer? Do you realize that it is on the cloud? That you need to kind of download it in the background whenever you do that? And indeed, what that extreme degree of dependency, of reliance on these companies, which is largely invisible, entails, is the fact that these become pressure points. These can be weaponized. And it is not that much of a kind of science fiction scenario. In a way, kind of Trump has already been showing, and the Trump administration has already been hinting to that, at that, in the sense that you can threaten countries. Say you are in a trade negotiation with a country, and that country uses for essential communication, logistics operation, for essential information communication operation, which now are intertwined with any economic activity, basically, and also with survival economic activities responsible, for example, for delivering food, for supplying essential goods, for transportation. If you're in a trade negotiation like that and the country is not doing what you want, you can blackmail this country and saying, if you don't do this, you may have some disruption. Or in turn, the other way around, you can weaponize other forms of dependence of that country to obtain very favorable conditions for your tech companies, which is exactly what Trump, as a big tech ambassador, has been doing with countries such as Malaysia and other countries. We are seeing how dangerous this can get when you have basically no alternative whatsoever. And this is why some countries finally in Europe are dawning to the fact that you need, at least in some very essential services, such as kind of instant messaging, to avail yourself of some working alternative in case things really get tense.
I think just to jump also on this conversation, because I think this is also why we wrote the report, not only as a report that recommends regulations and ways of taxing the companies, but also emphasize a lot the need to build alternatives and the need to build a public-led alternative, in the sense that this doesn't mean that there is no space for privates, but it does mean that there must be public institutions, new public institutions, democratic institutions that are created that can steer the ecosystem, that can design differently the technology, and that can prepare the alternatives in a way that is not simply just copy pasting. We will replicate exactly everything that Google is offering, but now it will be open source, or now it will be in competitive markets or whatever. But it's actually about, how do we really need to interact with technology? What are the technologies that we need? But even let's say we don't have that alternative, I think that governments can still decide to tax these companies, and a government like the UK government has a way to bargain. And this is the power of the buyer. Google may try to threaten and say, no, I will just leave you out of Google search. But that will also mean that Google will lose a lot of money because of the ads that will not be selling because they are not offering Google search. And it will also show the rest of the countries in the world what Google is capable of. So sometimes I also think that policymakers need more guts. They need to say, hey, we're doing it. And this actually goes back to the history of the report, because we never thought about, it's not that we were organically thinking about the report. It was that Brazil, the Brazilian government, in particular a judge, decided that because Twitter was not complying, they had to forbid Twitter inside Brazil. And they did it. Of course, it was technically complicated. Then, of course, Elon Musk and so on were trying to say this government is authoritarian. They don't enable you free speech, when actually it's the other way around. These are the companies that control whose voices get amplified and which ones get completely silent. But still, and on that basis, and by trying to support the Brazilian government, we drafted a letter that was, let's say, the starting point that then resulted in the report. So we need to develop alternatives, but we shouldn't wait until these alternatives are ready to take a step forward and say, let's tax these companies. These are the richest companies on earth. And also they are the ones that are paying, in terms of the share of their income and profits, very, very low, if any, corporate taxes.
I'm just picking up on that. I suppose the response from the industry, from big tech itself, is something like, that's all well and good, but look, the reason that we exercise these enormous monopolies is because it actually generates a consumer benefit, right? This is huge economies of scale from Google being a near monopoly in searches on the internet, from Facebook having however many billion people, mostly in the English and Spanish speaking world, signed up to it, right? Facebook is valuable because everybody's on Facebook. And you could think about breaking up or doing something else. It just won't be as good. Those economies of scale disappear. And that feels to me like you're offered a trade-off, right? The trade-off is roughly you get a better service, says big tech, even if it means sacrificing some control over the technologies itself. How would you have a public provision, let's say, of something like an internet search that would be as good as Google or instant messenger or some other bit of, the infrastructure we all use? Because it feels to me like if it's a direct competition on that basis, you are going to lag behind in saying what your alternative will offer.
Well, definitely what you're saying is right. This is an industry where there is a tendency to generate what in economics we would call natural monopolies. So the solution to a natural monopoly, which basically is a case in which you gain more efficiency by having a single company, a single organization, let's say, to put it more broadly, offering the service that results in lower costs and therefore higher benefits potentially for the consumers. But the trade-off there is, in a way, a fake one, because it's not that the only two options that you have in town are either leaving Google doing whatever they want because they get the efficiencies, and also because their search engine is the best out there because we've been searching there during decades. And there is something else in terms of these monopolies, and I will get back to that in 1 second. But the alternative is not competition, certainly, because there are other things that you could do. And these other things, if you go back to the history of every single public service, is having state-owned companies, having public companies offering the service. Then you can say, okay, but Google is the best search engine out there. And we need to ask ourselves, why? And this is because what they are offering, which is a machine learning model, these are models that get better the more data they process. So it's like a means of production that appreciates the more we use it. And we've been feeding and feeding and feeding this algorithm, again, as I was saying, for decades. So this is one of the reasons why we should think of solutions that include also really taxing the data, taxing the appropriation of knowledge, getting access to that knowledge. But I also think that there is a point when we need to start asking ourselves, okay, where shall we start? Because if we just accept, we will need to accept that we may lose some efficiencies. But what is the cost of efficiency? And it's not just about efficiency versus competition or efficiency versus less money for a few companies and more distribution, but also about the power to decide, again, which technologies you want to develop. Because these are the same companies that are developing technology for the genocide in Gaza. These are the same companies that are providing the infrastructure on top of which companies like Palantir offer the technology to ICE and broadly around the world to go against the majorities of the workers when their technologies are used for control in the workplace, when they are used for replacing creative thinking. So I think that we need to see always the whole picture. Yes, I mean, we cannot just lie and say everything will be great when you develop an alternative, but at least we need to understand why it's so necessary. And I would connect that to the fact that we need to start by building alternatives for the public sector. If there is one place where this is way more urgent and at the same time where the feasibility is easier, not easy, but easier to guarantee, that's the public sector.
I mean, on that, what you've talked about, I suppose, is a challenge to one version of how you regulate big tech, which is a standard, I mean, the Competition and Markets Authority view in this country, right? Which is, we just have a bit more competition in some form. And if we can't get competition, we'll have something that simulates competition. You're talking about something more substantially radical than that, which is a change in the ownership and how a market is structured and how a product operates and more democratic control over it on one side. That's one version of how to regulate this. You also, I think, pick up on the sort of European Union GDPR version of events, which is that, like, if you just have private control over your data, this will resolve a whole stack of other problems there. And as you say, of course, the data only becomes valuable once you aggregate it. And that this entire sort of rhetoric of, hey, if you control your data personally, and if you have some personal control over your data, this is as much as you need to do. I think you present quite a radical challenge to that view as well in your report.
I mean, I think this has been the big illusion of European policymaking, not just on this issue, but specifically, particularly on this issue. I mean, the idea that through regulation, you solve the problems, and through the kind of Brussels effect, you force all countries to comply. And this is not to say that regulation is not necessary and it is not useful. I mean, it is indeed, but it needs to be accompanied by ownership. And I think a key element in this policy paper was really this. I mean, really, let's really focus on ownership, because if you don't own these companies, if you don't own the means of data production and data collection, ultimately you are always in a position of weakness vis-a-vis these companies. Therefore, the question is ultimately, how do we do that? And I think that already Cecilia was hinting at some of the possible ways. I mean, ultimately, I think that in Europeans and Latin American countries already have an experience of how you deal with that. I mean, state-owned or part state-owned companies joint venture across different companies or different countries. I mean, there is Airbus in the European Union. There's many examples. It doesn't need to be, I mean, ideally, it would be a kind of publicly owned, a kind of community managed, but there's many also kind of hybrid forms that you can adopt, at the very least, to address some key junctures in the ecosystem. I think something important with digital sovereignty generally is not to fall prey of the illusion that you can have complete sovereignty, which would be kind of autarky, kind of in economic terms. Because not even countries such as the US or China have complete sovereignty. Perhaps they achieve, say, 80% sovereignty or 90% sovereignty, not even then, because also is not really a sort of a desirable solution to be completely self-enclosed, as it were, economically or in terms of the services. But if we look at the condition of the European Union, I mean, if you look at the map that was also showing today, that the map of big companies around the world is the concentration of companies, digital services companies in the US is so enormous, is so asymmetric that you really realize that at the very least there are some areas where you need to start intervening. I mean, and starting, of course, from the areas where you know that you have some advantage, that there is some realistic chance of installing yourself there, to also perhaps kind of create a demonstration effect that if you manage to do it in one area, you can generalize it to other areas.
And then I would add that the main problem of the GDPR is that it's only focusing on data. I mean, there are a lot of things that we could add that we're missing in that regulation, but even the best data governance that you can get is still just data governance. And it's not just about governing data, it's about governing the ecosystem. If there is one keyword here, this is ecosystem, networks, the complementarities between all the pieces of the puzzle. This is with Amazon, Microsoft, Google through the cloud, orchestrate and control beyond ownership. And until we understand that this operates completely differently from the car industry in the past, from how, I don't know, a mass consumption goods company operates, we will keep on failing. And it's not just about, indeed, it's not enough with regulations. But the problem is not that Europe was regulating too much or that Europe was just regulating. It's that Europe had a wrong diagnosis. And this, I think, we need to say it. Because the problem ends up being big tech companies are the bad guys without really looking at how the ecosystem is orchestrated, at how these companies sit at the core of a very complex network with many complicit actors, with a lot of companies that strategically subordinate because it's their way to capture value, profit, and so on. So in this complex scenario, in this network, of course, it doesn't make sense to speak of a country producing everything in-house. But sovereignty, again, is not about national production. Sovereignty is about deciding what type of things you want to produce and you don't want to produce, what type of technology you want to consume. Sovereignty is about being able to audit the algorithms that you will be consuming as a state, but also citizens in general. So it's totally compatible with an international solution. And there is a need to build an international, collective, communitarian, public-led solution because the planet cannot cope with this technology. And this is important because when we are looking at digital technologies, we keep on, I mean, it only takes 1 second. I guess probably you go on Google or an AI model and you search a Starmer, and the keywords that come with a Starmer probably will be things like growth, 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 growth. And this is problematic because we are in the midst of an ecological crisis. And these technologies particularly have a huge ecological footprint. So we need also, when we're thinking about the alternatives, to compute this. And this is another reason why we need an international perspective and solution. Final reason why we also need it is, yes, we're speaking a lot about state responsibilities. But how to make sure that the state is accountable? How to make sure, I'm from Argentina, how to make sure that Milei is not in power and then either destroys everything or uses everything for surveillance. And you don't need a Milei because also sometimes progressive governments may operate in the same ways. So how can we develop the checks and balances? How can we make sure that we create public institutions that are not controlled by the specific administration that is governing this or that economy? Building international solutions is a way to contribute to that. Democratizing governance structures and including different types of actors without giving the space to the tech companies to capture that as well is another one.
I mean, you preempted slightly my question there, which is that it's been a recurring theme the whole sort of after order series, which is the increasing fusion of the state with private capital in various different ways, right? So we had a good discussion with Quinn Slobodian and Ben Tarnoff about their book Muskism, the way in which Elon Musk and his various different guises and companies has become a kind of integral part of what the US state is doing. And you can see Trump, as you put it yourself, as a sort of battering ram for US big tech. These are things that are quite integrated into the state in different ways. Now, Palantir, I mean, absolutely, tentacle-like all over the place into the British state now. So it's not presumably as easy as just going, let's have a publicly owned bit of this, because that publicly owned bit of this could easily be switched into working for the benefit of pre-existing very large private capital. And that's clearly something that can happen.
Absolutely. And it has always been the case. I mean, we wouldn't have US multinational corporations if it wasn't for the policies of the US government, starting, of course, by completely drafting the antitrust policies, but also including things like not regulating as they should tax avoidance, not controlling for tax avoidance and the loopholes that exist in the international tax regime. It's also about how they have strengthened the intellectual property rights regime in the US, but also push around the world to adopt the US intellectual property rights regime. And on top of that, it's about how the US government from the late 1970s onwards, I would say, has favored the expansion of venture capital. Then these days also corporate venture capital is very important, but venture capital that has created this periphery of startup companies that actually are not companies. They don't want to sell things. They are just producing knowledge and they aim for a big company to either purchase them or purchase the knowledge or keep on investing in what they are doing so that the big company gets access to the knowledge. So this symbiotic relationship between the big tech company that controls or the big pharma company that controls and the startup companies that are feeding their capacity to control by producing knowledge has been created by the US government. So what we are seeing now is an extreme version of this sort of complex interplay between corporate and political power. Of course, big tech companies are a creature of the US government as much as Chinese big tech are a creature of the Chinese government. But having said this doesn't mean that they are puppets. This doesn't mean that these companies don't have their own agency, which they do. They are geopolitical actors. They have a capacity to exercise what Susan Strange would describe as corporate diplomacy. They sit on the decision-making table of global capitalism, and it's not just simply Trump telling them do ABC or the companies telling Trump do ABC. It's like as if they were two governments negotiating how they are going to rule the world. So I think, yes, definitely today we see again an extreme version of this, and we see it in ways that are also directly impacting on other governments' capacity at such a deep level, really in the roots of why or how governments are supposed to be ruling and governing, that it becomes more concerning. But again, I think it's not completely new. It's just that now with all these administrations around the world pursuing their digital transformations, it's quite obvious the degree of dependence that they're facing. And perhaps this is why it feels that this tight fusion that you were discussing between the US government and the companies is more concerning than before, I would say.
So, okay, look, a lot of our discussion obviously focuses, because of where we are, on US big tech. But there's a kind of separate conversation, which you do bring into the report, about Chinese big tech, and in particular, the creation of a kind of Chinese internet, hidden behind the Great Firewall as it's usually presented. How does this affect your analysis? I mean, we're not dealing with one internet as you might have understood it once upon a time. We're looking at a world potentially where the internet itself and these technologies are already starting to separate into different spheres of influence, different forms of sovereignty that exist. How does that challenge what you're saying?
Well, first of all, the spheres of influence are more than just the Western world and China, because actually people these days access the internet through platforms. So actually we have Amazon's spheres of influence, Google's spheres of influence, Meta's spheres of influence. So we already have a completely compartmentalized internet. The question that follows, and usually people think, okay, when it comes to sovereignty, are you arguing that we should do the China way? And the China way is not only unfeasible for most countries in the world, and it's not only about the money that the state, the public sector could invest in creating the Chinese giants, but it's also that China prevented the companies from entering in the first place. Europe, Latin America, Africa, we're all about US big tech, so it's too late. But also, is this really what we should be aiming for? To replicate the same predatory system, but with local companies? I don't think so. So I really think that if there is a similarity between Chinese and US big tech, this is clearly that they operate as intellectual monopolies, that they capture knowledge, they capture data, and they use it to subordinate a whole set of other actors. So there is an opportunity to be in control. And being in control requires completely changing the playing field. It's not about winning the AI race. It's not about jumping into a race that is not the majority's race. And not only because we will lose it, but also because do we really need LLMs in our life for everything? Maybe we need a specific models for certain tasks. Do we need a specific model for translations? Yes, we can totally agree on that. Do we need a specific models that can check this? Or for instance, if a payment is legit or not? Yes, of course. But do we need generative AI to replace people's capacity to think and kids' capacity to learn how to think? No, definitely not. So I think it's about making those decisions. So again, it's never too late. And this is why it's also important for every government at every level to try to think of what they could be doing differently. And starting by being less dependent on big tech themselves. And big tech, and when I say big tech, it's big tech ecosystem. So it's also the complicit actors. I think it's a great starting point because you cannot think of creating an alternative or regulating or taxing if your everyday functioning depends on the technologies that come from these companies. Because it's not going back to the threat that you were mentioning. It's not just, okay, they will threat that they will cut the service for citizens. They will threat that they will cut your service and you will not be able to operate as a government. So definitely, the more we wait, the worse it gets. So yeah, it requires a lot of political will and guts, as I was saying before, but it's the only way forward.
The potential for international cooperation and regulation here is that you propose in the report. You talk about building a non-aligned technology movement, parallel to the non-aligned movement of the sort of post-war period and presumably involving a similar set of states. So in opposition to US big tech and to Chinese big tech, most obviously. And that as a potential counterweight to what big tech is doing. But, as you say yourselves, the UN Digital Compact, from last year, 2 years ago, has been basically defined by big tech. If it's supposed to be the international, or at least the process of international cooperation is what could be the barrier against some of this stuff, the prospects at the minute for a kind of multilateral regulation of big tech seem pretty threadbare, it has to be said. What are the grounds for thinking that this might actually work?
I mean, I think that you need to realize just how extreme the situation is and how skewed the landscape is towards, mainly from the European perspective, US companies. In the future, it may be also increasingly is Chinese companies. And therefore, in that situation, indeed, I think that an international perspective is necessary. This is not to say that a national and a regional one is not, but you need to work on a multi-scale perspective. And you need, I think, to work in a perspective of reciprocity. Ultimately, I will give you market access to my service market if you allow me to do the same, and if you put myself in the same condition as your company in my market, which is not at all the case with US companies that are basically being given complete freedom to do whatever they want and no conditionality whatsoever for their assets, and not being forced, for example, to transfer technology in the form of, for example, joint venture with European companies, ways in which these dominance at the very least could be mediated or negotiated. There is no negotiation whatsoever, which also means, I think it raises the question of how you redress a situation which is so extreme. And I think that partly you cannot just do it through, say, positive industrial policy, but also through negative industrial policy. At some point, you need to mandate very heavy regulations against the companies that you consider a public bad and a public evil. And also you need to perhaps even threaten them of being banned or filtered. I mean, this is an extreme measure, but at some point, you may also have to consider that. Mm-hmm. So partly you need to do that, and partly you need to establish, bear in mind the question of scale. I mean, these are companies that need a huge scale in order to be profitable and efficient, so that they need tens of millions, hundreds of millions of users. I mean, is not. You may also have companies that are not profitable and that may survive with tens of thousands of people, but being realistic, ultimately you need that kind of scale. And often the scale, either you get it not just nationally, but continentally, or even better, intercontinentally. So I think that there some collaboration across Latin America and Europe would be useful, where there is some kind of division of labor, which could be also kind of in a way politically mediated, in a sense that each region progressively establishes some advantage, some prominence in a given service and other in other services. And there is this kind of reciprocity where there is some exchange and some openness there. But I think that first and foremost, we need to take into account just how extreme the situation has gotten, and that not simply the creation of alternatives. Probably sometimes the creation of alternatives will not be enough if we also don't have more kind of negative policies against these dominant actors.
So to sort of get to the end of our discussion, you can write a report. We can all write a report, right, and make lots of good recommendations and have a good analysis and detail what ought to happen. The challenge, I think, always is what is the agency that will start to deliver this? Because it's not necessarily clear that the incentives are there for almost any government across the world right now to say, we're going to be the ones who stand up. You know, we talked about it's good to be the first person, because if you demonstrate you can do it, everyone else will fall in behind you. But nobody wants to be the first mover in a world that looks like this. So where's the agency going to come from? Where's the public demand for doing something like this?
I mean, definitely there's going to be public opposition coming from some quarters. There is an Amazon middle class, an Airbnb middle class that has become completely addicted, and that also derives income from these companies. I mean, the people who are renting rooms and houses on Airbnb, you need to realize that. I mean, it would be very naive to think that you're not going to get public opposition. There are people that have basically elevated use of Amazon to a sort of ultimate identified badge of membership and something that embodies their quality of life. So you need to take into account that you will have resistance from sections of society, from certain constituencies, and ultimately you need to show people why it is better. You need to realize that some of the alternative services will not be as user-friendly, or will not be, their price point will be higher than some of these other companies. And so in exchange for that, you need to show people why they should accept this bargain. So you need to show that brings jobs to your community, that brings more empowerment, more possibility of political control. But I think what is really important, you need to do a very active appeal to people. You really need to show people actively, persuade them actively. You need a persuasion campaign to show that this is the case.
I would add to what Paolo was saying that, first of all, there are a lot of social movements being created against big tech. I was only last week at Cables of Resistance, a huge conference in Berlin with over 500 people, like spending their weekend to discuss alternatives and to discuss how we build this different way of interacting and creating tech. This is why I also believe that we should start by the state. So I understand that, yes, we need to communicate and co-create with broader communities, as Paolo was saying, but it's not just about convincing my fellow citizen, accept a shitty technology because this will empower us in the long run, because I know this is not a good selling point. And this is why I would insist that we need to start by decoupling states from their own dependence on big tech. The state, the public sector, can cope with not so nice and user-friendly technology as long as it does the job. And we need to start small. Starting small would be, for instance, starting with education. Instead of using Google and Google Suite and Google Gemini AI and so on at school, can't we, with the public servants, with the teachers, with the university scholars like myself, but also those doing computer science and so on, can we just work together to try, and with the unions, to try to think about what would the technologies be if we had the opportunity to redesign them for schools. And I'm sure that we don't need the latest LLM. So we have the resources, we have the talent. We don't have like huge investments to do that. We just need to create the spaces where people can sit, discuss, and try to agree on some basic principles on how to work together developing this technology.
Paolo, Cecilia, thank you so much for joining us.
Our pleasure.
Thanks.